My parents left me an abandoned factory, and my brother took the luxury penthouse. He called me worthless and kicked me out at 2 a.m. I went back to the factory. But when I unlocked one sealed room inside, my life changed forever. The snow was falling the way it always does in Chicago at 2 a.m. Not gently, not poetically, but with that particular cruelty that feels personal, like the city itself has decided you've had enough good days, and it's time to collect. I was standing in the elevator of the building I had helped manage for 11 years, watching the floor numbers descend, holding a rusted set of keys my brother had thrown at me the way you throw bread crusts to pigeons, casually, without looking up. If you've ever been dismissed by someone who was supposed to love you, not fired, not rejected, but dismissed the way you dismiss something that was never important to begin with, then you already understand what I felt in that elevator. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even hurt exactly. It was something quieter and more dangerous than both of those things. It was the feeling of becoming very, very still inside. The building was called the Meridian, 82 floors of glass and steel, and the kind of architectural arrogance that announces itself from 6 blocks away. Our parents had built it together, our father the visionary, our mother the one who understood that visions need foundations. They'd spent 30 years pouring everything into it, and then, as if the universe operates on some cosmic irony schedule, they died within 14 months of each other. First our mother, then our father, as though he simply didn't see the point of continuing without her. I had been there for both of them. Every hospital visit, every medication schedule, every 3 a.m. phone call from a night nurse who needed someone to make a decision. I put my career on modified schedule. I turned down a partnership offer from a commercial appraisal firm in New York because my father had looked at me with those gray eyes and said quietly, without drama, "I don't want to die alone, Natalie." So I stayed. Harrison did not stay. Harrison flew in for the weekends when it was convenient and the holidays when it was expected, and he cried beautifully at both funerals in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He gave eloquent eulogies. He used the word sacrifice 7 times in our mother's service, and not once did he look at me when he said it. The estate attorney read the will 3 weeks after our father passed. I remember thinking the room smelled like lemon furniture polish and old paper, the smell of things being made official. Harrison received the penthouse, all 4,000 square feet of the 58th floor, along with the hedge fund, the liquid assets, the investment portfolio, the cars, the memberships, the accounts. A sum total, when I did the math later on a Tuesday morning, with my second cup of coffee, of approximately $42 million. I received a set of keys to a textile factory on the south side. The attorney read the address, 14th and Ashland. He paused in the way attorneys pause when they're professionally required not to show emotion. I wrote the address on the back of my program from my father's funeral. I don't know why I still had that in my bag. I think I just hadn't been able to throw it away yet. Harrison laughed. He actually laughed. Not cruelly, which would have been easier to process, just with that particular brand of amusement reserved for things that are beneath contempt. Dad always had a soft spot for lost causes, he said to the attorney. Not to me. That was in October. I moved into a furnished one-bedroom in Lincoln Park, the kind of apartment that exists in that strange purgatory between comfortable and depressing, where everything is technically fine and nothing feels like yours. I went back to work, full-time. I appraised commercial buildings during the day, and at night I told myself I was processing grief and not rage, because grief feels more dignified. I did not visit the factory. For 2 months, I did not visit the factory. I told myself it was because I was busy, because it was a crumbling liability with tax debt attached, and I didn't need to drive to the south side in November to confirm what I already knew. I told myself a lot of things that were technically true and fundamentally dishonest. The real reason was simpler. The factory was the proof. The proof that after everything, 11 years of management, 4 years of caregiving, every decision I had quietly made, and every opportunity I had silently declined, my father had looked at his estate and decided I was worth a condemned building and some tax debt. That was the thing I wasn't ready to stand in front of. And then Harrison called on a Thursday evening in December, 2 days before Christmas, and told me he needed me out of the penthouse by Sunday. I had been staying there for the final 2 weeks, sorting through some of our parents' personal belongings that the estate team had flagged as requiring family oversight: photographs, documents, the small objects that accumulate over a 30-year marriage and don't fit into any legal category but also feel impossible to simply box up and donate. He said he had buyers coming to look at furnishings. He said my presence was complicating the process. He said, and this is the part I need you to understand, the part that matters. He said that I should be grateful he'd been generous enough to let me play house in a penthouse I had no claim to. Play house. 11 years. Every lease renewal, every structural inspection, every time the HVAC system needed an emergency contractor at 7 a.m. on a Sunday, every quarterly report, every tenant complaint, every decision that kept that building operating at 94% occupancy when comparable properties in the same corridor were averaging 71%. Playhouse. I want to tell you I said something devastating. I want to tell you I stood in the foyer of that 58th floor penthouse, with Lake Michigan visible through the floor to ceiling windows behind me and the city lit up like a circuit board below. And I delivered some kind of speech that made him understand what he had done. But the truth is quieter than that. The truth is, I looked at him for a long moment, and I picked up the rusted keys from the bowl by the door where I'd been keeping them since October. And I walked to the elevator, and I pressed the lobby button, and I watched the doors close. The snow started somewhere around the 15th floor. By the time I reached the street, it was a blizzard. I sat in my car for 4 minutes. I know it was 4 minutes because I watched the clock on my dashboard with the focused attention of someone who is working very hard at something that looks like doing nothing. And then I put the address into my GPS, 14th and Ashland, and I drove south through a city that was turning white and silent and strange, the way Chicago does when the snow decides to mean it. The factory appeared through my windshield at 2:47 a.m., like something from a different century, which, technically, it was. The brick was the color of dried blood. The windows were the kind of shattered that looks intentional, and the sign above the entrance had lost enough letters that it now read simply Tex IL, like a message, like a question. The chain link fence around the perimeter had been cut in at least 3 places and repaired with the kind of optimism that gives up after the second attempt. I sat in the car for another moment. The snow was coming sideways now, the kind of Chicago wind that doesn't arrive. It invades. I pulled my coat tighter, and I got out. The rusted keys were 3 of them on a ring, 2 standard deadbolts, and one that looked older, heavier, with a shape I didn't immediately recognize. The main door opened on the second try. I found a flashlight app on my phone and stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Industrial decay has a specific smell: machine oil and concrete dust and time itself, if time had a scent. The space was cavernous, the kind of emptiness that has its own acoustic quality. Old textile machinery still stood in places like industrial ghosts, enormous rusted things that used to make something and now just occupied space. The ceiling was 40 feet above me, and even in the limited light of my phone, I could see the bones of the building. And that's when something shifted, because I am, professionally, a commercial property appraiser. I have spent my career learning to see buildings the way other people learn to see faces, not just the surface, not just the cosmetic condition, but the structure underneath, the bones, the engineering logic, the decisions that were made before the walls went up, the choices embedded in concrete and steel that tell you what a building was meant to become. I walked the perimeter of the first floor slowly. I noted the column spacing. I noted the load-bearing walls. I noted the slab thickness in places where the floor had cracked and you could see the cross-section. And I felt something I hadn't felt in 2 months, which was the specific kind of alertness that comes when the evidence in front of you doesn't match the story you were told. The foundation of this building was engineered for something significantly heavier than a textile factory. I know that sounds technical. Let me make it plain. This building's structural engineering, the depth of the footings, the column grid, the load calculations embedded in the concrete, was designed to hold a skyscraper, not a factory. Something with dozens of floors and hundreds of thousands of square feet, and the kind of load-bearing requirements that don't happen by accident or standard practice. Someone had engineered this foundation for a purpose that had nothing to do with making fabric. I stood in the middle of that freezing, snow-dusted cavernous space at 3 a.m., and I felt my pulse do something complicated. I went to the basement. The stairs were concrete and solid, which told me something. Derelict buildings let their cosmetic elements deteriorate first. Walls, windows, finishes. But load-bearing infrastructure, if it was built right, holds. These stairs were built right. At the bottom, I found a concrete corridor that ended at a door that did not belong to this building's era. Modern steel frame, recessed panel, biometric keypad, clean, like it had been installed recently. The third key, the heavy one, the one I hadn't recognized, wasn't actually a key at all. When I looked closer at the keypad, I saw a small circular depression. I pressed my thumb against it with no real expectation. Nothing happened. I pressed my index finger. Nothing. I was about to step back when some reflex memory surfaced. My father, taking my hand at the hospital during one of his final weeks, pressing my palm against his chest and saying something I dismissed as the morphine talking. "You already have everything you need, Nat. You just don't know where to look yet." I pressed my palm flat against the biometric reader. The door opened. Inside was a climate-controlled room the size of a large walk-in closet, a single table, a lamp on a timer that blinked on when the door opened, and on the table, a leather folder the color of cognac with a brass clasp, next to a sealed envelope addressed in my father's handwriting to Natalie, the real foundation. I sat down on the concrete floor because my legs made that decision for me. I opened the folder first. There are moments in life when information arrives, and you can feel the architecture of everything you understood rearranging itself around you in real time. This was one of those moments. Inside the folder was a corporate ownership structure I'd never seen before. A holding company called Ironclad Holdings, LLC, registered in Delaware, with Natalie Ann Hartwell listed as sole beneficiary and controlling interest through a trust our father had established 16 years ago. Attached to this was a master ground lease agreement, 99 years, established in 1989, renewed and restated in 2003, and set to expire 30 days from the date my father had last reviewed the documentation. I read it again, and then I understood what I was looking at, and I put the folder down on the concrete, and I pressed both hands against the floor as if I needed to physically anchor myself to something real. The Meridian Tower, the building Harrison had received as his inheritance, the building his penthouse sat in, the building his entire financial empire was leveraged against, sat on land it did not own. The land beneath the Meridian belonged to Ironclad Holdings. Ironclad Holdings belonged to me. The ground lease expired in 30 days. I don't know how long I sat on that floor. Long enough for the cold to work its way through my coat, long enough for the snow outside to add another 2 inches to the streets. I opened my father's letter last, after I'd gone through every page of documentation, every exhibit, every amendment, every clause. I read the business documents first because I needed to understand before I could feel. His handwriting was shakier than I remembered from when I was young. The hospitalizations had done that, but his precision was intact. He wrote the way he always spoke, plainly, without ornament, with the kind of directness that some people mistake for coldness until they understand that it's actually the deepest form of respect. He believed words should carry their weight without decoration. He wrote that he had known, for most of his adult life, that Harrison was brilliant at surfaces and indifferent to foundations. He wrote that he had spent years hoping this would change, and had eventually accepted, with grief, that it would not. He wrote that the decision to structure the inheritance this way had not been made in anger or in the desire for any kind of punishment, but out of the recognition that the Meridian's real value, its enduring, generational value, was not in the building itself but in the land, and that the land required a steward who understood that truth. He wrote that he had watched me for 11 years, first as his building's manager, and then as his caretaker, and that what I had demonstrated in both roles was not just competence, but something rarer, the ability to see what things actually are rather than what they appear to be. He wrote, "The penthouse was never the inheritance, Natalie. The ground was always the inheritance. I'm sorry it took me this long to tell you clearly. I hope you can forgive me for the indirectness. I was afraid that if I told you while I was alive, he would find a way to take it from you before you were ready to hold it." He wrote, "You have 30 days from the date of this review. Use them well." The last line was the simplest. "I always saw you, even when I didn't show it well enough. The whole foundation was always yours." I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. I held the envelope against my chest for a moment, and I allowed myself exactly 1 minute of falling apart in the basement of a factory in the middle of a blizzard, alone, which was the appropriate place and time to do it. I cried the way you cry when grief and relief arrive at the same moment and can't be separated. Ugly, honest, brief. And then I stood up, picked up the leather folder, walked back up the concrete stairs, and I started making a list. Harrison called me the next morning at 9. I saw his name on my phone and felt nothing in particular, which was new. There had been a time when his calls still produced something, a kind of reflexive hope that this one would be different, that he would be different. That was gone now, replaced by something colder and more useful: clarity. He wanted to know if I had come to my senses. He wanted to know if I was ready to stop being difficult. He wanted to know, and this was the part I had been anticipating, the part that told me everything about what he knew and when he knew it, whether I'd had a chance to look at the factory properly. He mentioned, very casually, that he had a colleague who was interested in buying it for a redevelopment project. Nothing major, $50,000. Quick close, no inspection, as is. Very generous, considering the tax debt. $50,000. I want to sit in that number for a moment. I want you to understand that this was not a negotiating opening. He wasn't lowballing me expecting a counter. He was offering me $50,000 for a piece of land that, with the ground lease in play, was conservatively worth tens of millions of dollars. He was doing it with the casual confidence of someone who believes the other person doesn't know what they're holding. "I'll think about it," I said. "Don't take too long," he said. "These things have a way of falling through." I thought about my father's letter. "The whole foundation was always yours." "I won't take too long," I said. I hired a structural engineer that afternoon, not the first one, who was available immediately, and therefore made me nervous. The second one, Marcus Webb, who had a 6-week wait list and made an exception after I explained in brief, precise terms what I had found in that basement. He drove down on Saturday morning, walked the perimeter of the factory with me, descended into the basement, reviewed the column grid and footing depths, and came back up with an expression I recognized because I have worn it myself. The expression of a professional who has just encountered something that doesn't match the expected narrative. "This foundation was engineered for a high rise," he said. "Minimum 40 floors, possibly more. Whoever built this factory built it expecting to build something else on top of it eventually." He paused. "Or they built it on someone else's plans." "Or," I said, "someone buried the plans in the factory so that the building's purpose would be obscured until the right time." He looked at me. "That's a very specific theory." "I have documentation," I said. I also had, by this point, an attorney named Priya Okonkwo, who came recommended by 3 separate commercial real estate contacts as the person you called when the situation was genuinely complicated, and you needed someone who would remain unmoved by pressure. She reviewed the Ironclad Holdings documentation over 2 evenings, called me on the 3rd morning at 7 a.m., and said, without preamble, "Your father was either a genius or a deeply unusual man, and I think he may have been both." "Both," I confirmed. "The ground lease is valid. The reversion clause is airtight. The trust structure will hold. If the lease expires without renewal, the Meridian's mortgage goes into immediate incurable default, and the land reverts to Ironclad under the terms of the original agreement." She paused. "Natalie, do you understand what you're holding?" I thought about standing in that elevator at 2 a.m. with a set of rusted keys. I thought about Harrison's laugh in the attorney's office. I thought about the word sacrifice, said 7 times at a funeral by someone who hadn't earned the right to use it once. Yes, I said, I'm beginning to. The demolition notice arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by courier to both my Lincoln Park apartment and, somehow, my office, which told me that someone with access to city records had been thorough. An emergency order, citing structural hazard concerns, signed by a building inspector named Hector Vargas. Demolition scheduled for the following Friday, 10 days out. I read it 3 times, then I called Marcus Webb, who agreed to return to the factory with his full team and produce a structural assessment in 48 hours. Then I called Priya, who told me to document everything and not to respond to the notice directly. Then I drove to the factory and measured the foundation myself, every footing depth I could access, every column base, every load-bearing wall junction, and photographed everything. I filled a 64-gigabyte memory card. I made 3 copies. The structural assessment from Marcus Webb's team was unambiguous. The building met or exceeded all current municipal safety standards for its classification, and the foundation was, in his words, one of the most robust examples of over-engineered commercial construction I have encountered in 22 years of practice. The building was not a structural hazard. It was not, in any reasonable professional assessment, a candidate for emergency demolition. We submitted the assessment to the city's buildings department at 9 a.m. on Thursday. We submitted a formal challenge to the demolition order. We submitted a request for an independent review of Inspector Vargas's credentials and process. At 2 p.m., Priya received a call from the buildings department's legal office. At 4:30 p.m., the demolition order was suspended pending review. At 6 p.m., Inspector Vargas was placed on administrative leave. I found out later, from a contact at City Hall who owed me a professional courtesy, that Vargas had received a significant cash payment from a company registered to an address that traced through 3 layers of corporate structure to Naomi Hartwell's family trust. Harrison had underestimated something fundamental about the nature of my professional life. I have spent my career studying buildings that people have tried to hide things in. Structural compromises buried in renovation permits, environmental issues obscured in inspection reports. I know what hidden things look like. I know how they're formatted, where they're stored, and how to surface them. He had tried to bury a demolition order in bureaucratic paperwork, which is like trying to hide something from a professional excavator by putting it underground. The gala was Harrison's idea, and it was either very brave or very stupid, which, in my experience, are often the same thing at the early stages. A formal investor event at the Meridian's private club on the 44th floor, white linens, string quartet, the kind of lighting that costs more per hour than most people earn in a day. The stated purpose was to introduce a new capital partnership for a landmark redevelopment initiative. The actual purpose, which everyone in the room understood without saying, was to secure emergency funding before the ground lease situation became public knowledge. Harrison did not know that I had been aware of the gala for 11 days. He had sent the invitations through the Meridian's event coordination team, and the event coordinator had worked with me for 6 years and had the good sense to mention it. I arrived in an emerald silk gown that had been my mother's, altered slightly, but unmistakably hers. I watched Harrison's face when he saw me cross the threshold, and I watched it do the thing faces do when the mind is attempting to process multiple contradictory pieces of information simultaneously. I looked like someone who belonged there. More specifically, I looked like someone who belonged there more than he did. Kenji Tanaka was standing near the bar, which I had anticipated. He was one of the 3 lead investors being courted for the capital partnership, and he was known among people who tracked commercial real estate at institutional levels for one consistent professional characteristic. He did not absorb losses graciously. He had walked away from 2 major deals in the previous decade after discovering undisclosed encumbrances in due diligence, and he had, in both cases, pursued the parties who had withheld information with a legal patience that bordered on the geological. I approached him with a glass of sparkling water I had no intention of drinking, and I introduced myself by my professional name and title. His expression shifted. He recognized my appraisal firm's work, which I had expected. We discussed the Chicago commercial market for approximately 4 minutes, which was the appropriate amount of small talk before the information became material. Then I told him, in the same tone of voice I would use to discuss a zoning variance or a floor area ratio calculation, that the ground lease underlying the Meridian's land had 30 days remaining, that the lease had not been disclosed to investors, and that upon expiration the outstanding mortgage, $300 million, would go into immediate incurable default. I showed him the key documents on my phone. Priya had prepared a 2-page summary specifically for this purpose. Kenji Tanaka read it once. He read it again. He excused himself from my company with the particular quiet efficiency of a man who is performing a financial calculation in real time and doesn't like the answer. I watched him find his assistant. I watched the assistant make a call. I watched Tanaka set down his champagne glass, untouched. Harrison saw this. He crossed the room faster than I'd seen him move in years. That specific kind of movement that looks like it's trying not to look like running. He reached me. He said my name in a register I hadn't heard from him before, something below his usual register of dismissal, something with actual urgency in it. What did you say to him? The truth, I said. Natalie. His voice was doing something complicated. This isn't the place. You made it. The place, I said. You invited investors to fund a building that sits on land you don't own, Harrison. You didn't disclose the ground lease. You didn't disclose the expiration. You have been presenting a fabricated picture of this asset's financial standing to potential partners. I paused. I'm a licensed appraiser. Disclosure of material facts is not optional for me. It's mandatory. He grabbed my arm. I want to be clear that this was a mistake that I had not anticipated, but was not, in retrospect, surprising. Harrison had always had a particular difficulty with moments when he lost control of a narrative, the same way some people manage uncertainty well and others manage it by escalating. He grabbed my arm in a room full of investors and bankers and 2 security personnel who had been briefed by the venue's management that any physical altercation would result in immediate removal of the instigating party. He was removed. The room did not go silent so much as it went careful. That particular quality of professional stillness that descends when something has happened that will need to be processed, discussed, and remembered. I set down my water glass, thanked the server nearby for a genuinely pleasant event, and excused myself. The conservatorship petition arrived 6 days later. I will give Harrison this. It was a sophisticated play. Not morally sophisticated, nothing about it was moral, but structurally clever in the way that things are clever when they've been thought through by someone who is frightened and has access to expensive legal help. He had located my therapy records from the period of my parents' final illnesses, 2 years of sessions with a grief counselor during which I had apparently said things, true things, accurate and honest things about my emotional state during an extended period of caregiving stress that could be extracted, decontextualized, and presented as evidence of psychological instability. The petition claimed that I was unable to manage my financial affairs, that I was experiencing dissociative symptoms, that the decisions I had made regarding Ironclad Holdings reflected delusional thinking about the nature of my inheritance. The goal was clear. If he could have me declared legally incompetent, control of Ironclad Holdings would transfer to a court-appointed guardian, and he could position himself, through his legal team, to influence or assume that guardianship. I walked into the deposition without visible counsel, which was a choice Priya and I had discussed at length. She was present but seated in the back as an observer, not at the table. I answered every question. I answered them calmly, precisely, with the specific kind of detailed professional accuracy that is difficult to attribute to someone experiencing delusional thinking. The opposing attorney asked me to explain the ground lease structure. I explained it in a way that suggested I could teach a graduate course on the subject. He asked me to explain Ironclad Holdings' corporate structure. I explained it at a level of detail that the court reporter had to ask me twice to slow down. Then I said, with a steadiness I had been practicing for 3 weeks, that I understood why my brother was frightened. I said it without sarcasm, without any audible edge. I said it as plainly as my father used to say things. My brother is frightened because he built an empire on a foundation he didn't own, and the person who owns it is not going to do what he expected. That's not delusional thinking. That's real estate law. The petition was dismissed. But here is the part I want you to understand. The part that matters about what came next. I could have moved then. The dismissal gave me clean legal standing. Priya had the reversion documentation ready. I could have filed immediately, triggered the default, and let the institutional machinery take over. Harrison would have been out in weeks rather than days, and the outcome would have been the same. I didn't do that. I told Priya I wanted to wait. She looked at me across her office with the expression of a very good attorney watching a client make a decision they've already calculated. "Okay," she said. "How long?" "Until the board meeting," I said. The emergency board meeting was Harrison's last attempt at a controlled narrative. He had convened it himself, the building's lender representatives, the Residents Association Board, several institutional investors, 2 bank executives. The stated agenda was strategic asset realignment, which is the language people use when they need to make a crisis sound like a plan. Harrison had prepared a presentation. Naomi had prepared architectural renderings of a redevelopment concept. There was a slide deck. There were color-coded charts. I arrived 7 minutes late, which was also a choice. The room was in a private conference space on Gioni's, the 40th floor, the kind of room that has been designed to communicate authority. Dark wood, leather chairs, a view of the lake that on a clear day makes you feel like you're making decisions from a position of permanent advantage. I sat at the far end of the table. I set my bag down. I folded my hands. I waited. Harrison presented his plan. He was composed, I'll give him that. The surface was intact in the way that surfaces can remain intact when enormous pressure is being applied from within. Naomi gestured to the architectural renderings with the confidence of someone who has prepared a story and is going to tell it to the end. The bank representatives listened with the particular expressionlessness that bank representatives deploy when they are deciding whether to remain at a table. When Harrison finished, he looked at me. "Natalie, I believe the estate attorney made a drafting error in the distribution of certain holding documents. We'd like to rectify that. Today." He slid papers down the table. A deed transfer. Ironclad Holdings to a joint entity. I would receive a minority stake. A family solution, he said, to a family misunderstanding. I looked at the papers. I thought about a set of rusted keys thrown across a foyer. I thought about the word playhouse. I thought about the therapy records filed in a federal court proceeding. I slid the papers back. "The ground lease expired at midnight last night," I said. The room took a moment to process this. Priya, from her seat to my right, opened her laptop. She pulled up the Cook County Recorder of Deeds live registry. The document had been filed at 12:03 a.m., the automatic filing that had been queued and waiting since the moment Priya and I had determined the expiration date. The reversion of the land parcel from ground lease to fee simple ownership, recorded in Ironclad Holdings' name. She turned the laptop so the table could see it. I watched the bank, executives' faces. I watched the moment when financial professionals encounter information that requires them to immediately recalculate every assumption they have been operating under. It is a specific kind of stillness, a held breath quality, before the calculation's complete and the new reality becomes undeniable. One of the bank representatives said very quietly to his colleague, "We need to make a call." Harrison said my name. He said it the way people say names when they are trying to locate something. Themselves, maybe, or the version of the situation where they still had control. "The mortgage is in immediate, incurable default," I said. "That's not a negotiating position. That's the contract language your lenders drafted." I looked at the bank representatives. "You'll want to pull your copies." The room did not explode. It imploded, which is different, quieter, more interior, the way structural failures actually happen in buildings. Not the dramatic sudden collapse of Hollywood physics, but the slow, comprehensive transfer of load from one system to another until the original system simply cannot hold what it was holding. Naomi stood up. She was looking at Harrison with an expression I recognized from the way people look at something they invested in when they finally accept that it was never going to pay off. She set her wedding ring on the table, not threw it, set it, which was somehow more final, and she picked up her bag and she left the room without speaking to anyone, including me. The investors began calls. The bank executives were already on their phones. The particular rapid murmur of people conveying bad news upward through institutional structures. Harrison sat with his hands flat on the dark wood table, and he looked at me across the length of the room, and I thought about what my father had written. I always saw you, even when I didn't show it well enough. What do you want? Harrison said. His voice was stripped of its register now, the performance layer fully gone. I want this to be over, I said. So here are the terms. Ironclad Holdings will offer a renewal of the ground lease at current market rate for a 20-year term. You and the building's institutional owners can negotiate that together. If you choose not to renew, I'll work with the lenders on an orderly process. I paused. I'm not here to destroy anything, Harrison. I'm here because our father built something real, and he wanted it to survive. I'm the person he trusted to make sure it did. I left before the room had finished processing. I had said what needed to be said, and there was nothing else I wanted from that space. In the elevator down, I thought about my mother's emerald gown, which I had worn to the gala, and which was now back on its hanger in my closet. I thought about my father's handwriting, shakier than I remembered, but precise. I thought about a blizzard and a set of rusted keys and a basement door that opened to a palm-pressed flat against a reader. You already have everything you need. You just don't know where to look yet. The fraud investigation began 3 weeks later, initiated not by me, but by 2 of the institutional investors who had discovered, in their post-meeting due diligence, discrepancies that went significantly beyond the ground lease non-disclosure, the undisclosed demolition order attempt, the Inspector Vargas payment, and a series of financial representations that had been made to lenders over the preceding 18 months that did not align with the building's actual legal standing. Harrison's attorney entered negotiations almost immediately. It did not help much. Naomi's architecture license review was triggered by a professional ethics complaint filed by, of all people, the building's department, related to the fraudulent demolition order documentation that had passed through her firm's systems. She maintained, until very near the end, that she had been unaware of the specifics, and perhaps parts of that were true, but she had also signed certain documents. Signatures matter. I did not attend any of the proceedings. I had given my relevant documentation to the appropriate authorities, answered the questions I was asked, and returned to my work. There is a particular freedom, I discovered, in having done the precise thing that needed to be done, and then stepping back, not performing restraint, not calculating how it appeared, just genuinely, completely stepping back because the thing was done. The factory redevelopment took 14 months from the initial architectural concept to groundbreaking. The structural engineering firm Marcus Webb recommended had worked on 3 comparable adaptive reuse projects. The foundation, that extraordinary, over-engineered, secretly load-bearing foundation that my father had commissioned 30 years ago for reasons that had become clear only in retrospect, could support 3 additional floors of contemporary construction. We built them. The building is now a mixed-use community technology center. Coding education on the 2nd floor, small business incubator on the 3rd, a public access fabrication lab on the 4th. The original 1st floor retained its industrial ceiling height and now houses a community market. On the day of the soft opening, Marcus Webb stood next to me in the main entrance and looked up at the ceiling. 40 feet of original industrial space, exposed brick, the bones of a building that had been waiting for its purpose for decades, and said, "Your father knew exactly what he was doing." "He usually did," I said. "The penthouse. I want to tell you about the penthouse because that's where this began, and it's where this ends." The ground lease renewal was negotiated through institutional channels. I had no direct contact with Harrison during that process, and I didn't need any. The building changed hands twice in the 18 months following the default, which is the nature of highly leveraged assets when the underlying assumptions collapse. By the time it was fully resolved, the penthouse was part of a larger restructured ownership entity, and the entity's board, through processes I had nothing to do with, decided to offer me the unit as part of the land lease renegotiation. I accepted it, not because I needed it, not because of the square footage or the view or the fact that it was, technically, the most valuable residential unit in the building. I accepted it because my parents had built it, and because in it there was still a window seat in the eastern corner where my mother used to sit with her coffee on Sunday mornings, watching the lake shift from gray to silver to blue as the light changed, and I wanted to sit there. The morning after I moved in, I sat in that window seat with my own coffee and watched the light do exactly that. Gray to silver to blue. The city was already moving below. The particular Chicago morning of traffic and purpose and cold air that carries sound farther than you expect it to. Lake Michigan was flat and enormous and indifferent in the way that large bodies of water are indifferent, which I have always found comforting rather than bleak. If you've ever had something taken from you, not just a thing, but a narrative, a version of yourself that someone else decided for you, then you know that getting it back doesn't feel the way you imagine it will. It doesn't feel like winning. It doesn't feel like the moment at the end of the story when the music comes up and everything resolves into clarity. It feels quieter than that, and stranger, and more complicated. It feels like sitting in a window seat and drinking coffee and watching the light change, and understanding, maybe for the first time without grief attached to it, that you are exactly where you were always supposed to be. My father's letter is framed on the wall of my home office now. Not the whole letter, just the last 2 lines. The whole foundation was always yours. I always saw you. I had it done at a shop in the West Loop. Simple black frame, no mat, just the words in his handwriting. I look at it when I'm on calls, when I'm reviewing documents, when someone across a table assumes, as people still sometimes do, that the quiet one is the one with nothing to say. They mistook my silence for having nothing. They always do. My father knew differently. He engineered it that way. The ground was always mine. I just needed a blizzard and a rusted key and one very long night in a basement to find it.